This program is a presentation of UCTV for educational and non-commercial use only.
Glantz is an independent journalist who writes about the impact of war on those who've experienced it directly: soldiers and civilians, aid workers, and journalists. He reported extensively from inside Iraq from 2003 to 2005 and has been covering veterans issues since his return to the United States. He has filed numerous reports delving into the issue of post-traumatic stress disorder and related problems, as well as detailing the difficulties that veterans face in their efforts to obtain services from the Veterans Administration. Currently, he is a Rosalind Carter Mental Health Journalism Fellow at the Carter Center and a Fellow at the Hettinger Institute on Education and the Media at Columbia University Teachers College. In addition to his book, The War Comes Home, he is the author of the San Francisco Chronicle bestseller, How America Lost Iraq, and the co-author of Winter Soldier, Iraq and Afghanistan. Those books, or some of those books, are available courtesy of Borders out front and will be able for your purchase after his lecture. So, Aaron Glantz, we're delighted to have you with us. Please welcome Aaron.
Thank you for that warm introduction, and also for the remarks from Congresswoman Capps earlier. I was sitting and listening and hearing what you were saying, and it is such an honor to be here at the 30th anniversary of your husband's class. And the fact that this class has been going on for 30 years is a tribute to the commitment that he had and that University of California, Santa Barbara continues to have to actually listening to people who have been through the war. And it's not an easy thing to do, and I really appreciate it. I was listening to the story that you told about Walter Kapp's first idea to teach the course, and how he was up in the hills and he interacted with two veterans who went on to be leader in the Vietnam Veterans Movement. And you said their language was coarse, it was rough, and it was direct, but it was narrative. And that was very, very different than all of the other discussions that were going on top of that hill, which were very Socratic and intellectual. And I can relate to that because that's my own experience coming back from the war in Iraq. I'm going to talk today a little bit about my own experience in Iraq, how they led me to report on veterans after I came home. I'm going to give an overview of the issues that are facing our returning Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans. I'm going to talk about the battle that our soldiers have to fight with the Pentagon to get fair treatment while they're still in the military, the battle that they have to fight with the VA after they get out, and then I'm going to talk about where we can go from here. I did not go to Iraq as a soldier. I went as a journalist. And I did not go as an embedded journalist who was with the troops. I went as an unembedded journalist. I was there to talk to the Iraqi people and see how they felt about the war. I did this even though I had no previous experience in war reporting, but I was sitting in Sacramento as a state capitol reporter for a radio station, and as a state capitol reporter, I always thought it was important to bring in the voices of the people that would be affected by the legislation that was being debated. For example, if it was an immigration issue, I would have to talk to immigrants and their families and not just Republicans and Democrats. If the issue was related to teaching, I would talk to teachers and students in addition to politicians. As I watched the coverage of the Iraq War, or the lead up to the Iraq War, in the media, it was like there were only two people that would be affected by this war: George Bush and Saddam Hussein. It was as if they were going to arm wrestle each other over the future of the Middle East. And there was no discussion anywhere about how this would affect 25 million Iraqi people, or how this would affect hundreds of thousands of American soldiers who were being mobilized for the battle. And so I went on my own, essentially, first to Turkey and Jordan to cover the lead up to the war and how people in the region thought about it. And then after the fall of Saddam Hussein on April 9th, 2003, I got in a taxi cab in Amman, Jordan, an old orange and white checkered 1970 station wagon taxi cab with a French journalist friend of mine, and we just went to Baghdad to try to find out what the Iraqi people thought of the war. When I was in Iraq, I did not interact very much with the American soldiers for a very simple reason. They had guns. And because I had elected not to embed with them, they were pointed in my general direction, though not specifically at me. And I just thought that the safest thing to do was to avoid them and the other combatants so as to not get caught up in the crossfire. And this was brought home to me very, very strongly on my very first day in Iraq. I was going in this taxi cab to meet another journalist friend of mine at the Al Fanar Hotel, which was across the street from the Palestine Hotel on the banks of the Tigris River. The Palestine is that huge hotel next to the old Sheraton Hotel in downtown Baghdad that many of the journalists were staying in early on in the war, and then later on the richest contractors were staying there. And there was a U.S. military checkpoint right in front of this Al Fanar and Palestine hotel that I was going to. And as we reached this checkpoint, there was a young man manning the checkpoint. And his helmet was a little bit too big for his head, and his uniform was actually a little bit too big as well. And he seemed very nervous, and he told us to turn the car around. And I thought, with my no war reporting experience, oh, I should get out and talk to him. This was my first mistake. So I got out of the car, and he cocked his weapon at me. And I tried to talk to him about saying, I'm an American journalist, and I'm here, and I'm just going right across the street to meet a colleague of mine. But he saw that I have kind of olive skin, and I had dressed primarily so that I would fit in Iraqi society, and so I could tell he wasn't listening to a word I was saying. And he continued to point his weapon at me, so I did another stupid thing, which is that I reached for my passport. And then he looked like he was about to shoot me, and I could have been hurt there on the spot, except that my French friend who was in the car with me, who happened to be blonde, stuck his head out the window of the vehicle and said, is there some kind of problem here? And at that point, the soldier threw his weapon over his shoulder, identified that there was somebody who was blonde that was clearly not a threat to him, said to my French friend that his translator should be clearer, ordered me back into the car, and we drove around the corner. So suffice it to say that after that, I took a lot of precautions to be very, very careful in my interaction with these American soldiers. And over the next 3 years, I covered many, many stories where the American soldiers were the enemy. I interviewed people whose families had been imprisoned and tortured at Abu Ghraib. I interviewed families whose homes had been bulldozed by American tanks. I was in Fallujah after the April 2004 U.S. siege there, when so many people, many of them women and children, were killed by the U.S. military that the municipal graveyard of Fallujah that the municipal football stadium of Fallujah had to be turned into a graveyard for the dead. You can just imagine the kind of devastation that is if, I'm from San Francisco, if we had to turn Candlestick Park into a graveyard. And I remember reporting in Fallujah after the siege there, as some of the bodies that had been rotting in the street were finally being buried because the situation had got a little bit safer. And that was my experience reporting in Iraq. And then I came home. I came home in the first time in June or May or June of 2004. I went back again in 2005. And when I got home and I would talk to people about the war, they always wanted to debate politics with me. And that's why I wrote down this thing that you said, Congresswoman, about their language was coarse, rough, and directly narrative. Because people would ask me when I would give talks like this after my reporting in Iraq what Dick Cheney was thinking. And I would say, I have no idea what Dick Cheney is thinking. I've been in Iraq. Why don't you ask me about that? Why don't you ask me what I saw in Iraq? Anyway, that was not my only problem. I was having trouble sleeping at night. My wife's family lived next to the ABC 7 News helicopter pad in Los Angeles. Every time the helicopter would go up and every time it would go down, it would put me back in Iraq. I had a lot of muscle aches and pains that I couldn't explain, that I think were caused by my whole body just being full of stress. And what ended up helping me out of this situation was the practice of journalism. I got a contract to write a book about my experiences in Iraq, How America Lost Iraq, where I chronicled how, in my view, the Iraqi people went from welcoming the overthrow of Saddam Hussein towards firing at American troops and feeling support for those kinds of actions. And when I toured the book across the country, when I gave speeches like the one I'm giving right now, when I would do radio and television interviews, the most incisive questions, the most interesting statements always came from the veterans in the audience. And the reason for this is that even if we disagreed about how we thought about the war, at least we were talking about the same war. And I had finally met some people who, when I was talking about Fallujah with them, they could imagine the place that I was talking about. They could see it, just like I could see it. And so I started to report on veterans issues. I got a contract to write this book, and initially it was just called The War Comes Home. It was just going to be a listening expedition. It was going to be a book that was written for the family members of those who had gone off to fight in Iraq and Afghanistan and wondered what had happened to their loved ones when they came home. Why were they so different? It was going to be a book for the Vietnam veteran or the Gulf War veteran who wondered how their experience in combat and afterwards was the same or different than the younger generation. It was a book that was going to be for the mass majority of Americans who are so busy debating the iPod versus the iTouch that they don't understand what that debate and that lack of respect that they're giving to the veteran who's sitting right next to them, what effect that is having on them. And so I started working on this book. And the more stories I heard, the more reporting I did, the more information I gathered, the more important it became to me that I subtitle the book Washington's Battle Against America's Veterans. So the book is called The War Comes Home, Washington's Battle Against America's Veterans, because we make our veterans battle for every single benefit that we promise them when we send them off to war. The very first battle that our veterans have to fight when they come home is the battle for recognition. And what I mean by that is, in this case, recognition that there is even a war going on. The Pew Center for People and the Press reports that less than 2% of news stories in the last month were about the war in Iraq. That counts the unembedded journalism that I was doing, the embedded journalism, the political coverage back here at home, all of that adding up to less than 2% of the coverage. And when you come home from the war and all you can see on television is the latest interview with the octuplet mom, and you've just been through a war, it's maddening. But this is more than something that's just cultural. It was done by design by the previous administration. You remember 2002, 6 years ago, when they started talking about this war. Donald Rumsfeld went in front of the cameras. You may remember him. He was the Secretary of Defense. And he said the war might last 6 days, it might last 6 weeks, but he doubted it would last 6 months. Here we are 6 years later. If he had told the American people that we would be at war for 6 years, that nearly 2 million Americans would have fought in the war, that 400,000 of them would have come home and filed for disability with the Department of Veterans Affairs, that 80,000 of them would have been classified as wounded, injured, or ill in combat by the U.S. military, that 300,000 would be coming back with post-traumatic stress disorder, and that another 300,000 would be coming back with traumatic brain injury, physical brain damage, often caused by roadside bombs. Maybe people would have thought that it wasn't such a cakewalk, and they wouldn't have gone for it. And it wasn't just the deception at the beginning of the war, but it was the refusal to release information as the war went on. So each of those statistics that I gave you are the kind of statistics that our government should be publishing regularly, so all of us will know what is involved in the war. But each of those statistics needed to be found by an enterprising journalist, a veterans group, a think tank, often using the Freedom of Information Act and the force of a lawsuit. And none of them were just simply announced by our government the way the generals would stand in front of the easel and announce the latest movements on the battlefield. And that's what I mean when I say the first battle is just the battle to be heard. I'm actually very hopeful about this part of our battle now that we have President Obama in office. Just this last week, President Obama lifted the ban on the photographing of the flag-draped coffins of those coming home who have passed, and left it up to the families about whether or not they wanted to share that experience with the rest of the country. I would suggest to him that it might not be a bad idea for his Secretary of Veterans Affairs, General Shinseki, or himself, or his Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, to hold a press conference once a month where they go over the latest figures of the casualties of this war and share them with the American people, and discuss with them how well the government is doing at meeting their needs. Many other branches of our government do this, and I think it's a very reasonable thing to ask with regard to our veterans. The first battle that our veterans have to fight happens even before they even get out of the military. And this is one of the ways that this war in Iraq is very, very different than the Vietnam War. During the Vietnam War, we had a draft, and almost everyone only went once. And 12 months to the day that you set foot in Vietnam, you were back here on American soil. But in this war, we have people who are going 2, 3, 4, 5, sometimes even 6 tours to Iraq and Afghanistan. We have 700,000 who have done at least 2 tours. And the reason for this is that our military is under tremendous pressure, fighting these 2 wars at the same time without a draft, to muster enough people for the battlefield. And one result of this is that a lot of people who have been through the war, who need to be taken care of, are being dishonorably discharged if they're no longer useful for fighting, just to make room for another body who can be sent off to war. I write in my book about Don Hanks, Tacoma, Washington. He served 14 years in the U.S. Army. He was in Iraq from 2003 to 2004. He came home and had trouble adjusting. He started to forget things. He had a temper. He needed help for post-traumatic stress disorder. But he didn't get it from the Army. And so he started to smoke marijuana to help him relax. The next thing he knew, he had failed a drug test, and he was dishonorably discharged from the United States Army after 14 years of service with no benefits to get his life right again. This has happened to thousands of people who have served in Iraq or Afghanistan, who have been given dishonorable discharges for drug use, for petty crime, for spousal abuse, after serving honorably in the war itself. Sometimes people come home and they don't do anything to break the rules, but they are clearly not usable for another deployment overseas. And for those people, the military has invented an excellent system of getting rid of them without giving them benefits to make room for another body. They call it the personality disorder discharge. Now, there's a good reason for this discharge. You know, we don't want really psychotic people in Iraq with a weapon in their hand. And so this discharge allows the military, if they've admitted someone who they should not have admitted, to get rid of them early on so that they do not endanger anyone. But the way that the Bush administration was using this policy was that people would come home from the war with post-traumatic stress disorder or traumatic brain injury or both, and they would be told, you're not suffering because you were hurt in the war. You've always been this way. You have a pre-existing condition. You have a personality disorder. It's not our fault. This has happened to over 20,000 people since the start of the war. Sometimes a soldier comes to the military and requests help and is told to go on and fight again in Iraq. We just learned that in the month of January, more of our active duty members of the United States Army committed suicide, they killed themselves, than were killed in combat in Iraq and Afghanistan combined. A major reason for this is the multiple tours and the fact that people who come home from their tour in Iraq or Afghanistan who tell the Army or the Marine Corps that they are not doing all right, that they need help, are ordered to go back again without that help. I was just writing an article recently about a specialist, John Fish, who lived in Paso Robles up the coast, who came back from his tour in Iraq. He signed up for the military on his 17th birthday. He joined the military because he loved first-person shooter video games. And he played the America's Army video game. It was his favorite. And he wanted to open up a weapons store. And he thought the best way to get training for that was to join the Army. Joined the Army on 17. He dropped out of high school, took his GED, and went off to train. Came back from Iraq, and even while he was over there, he came to understand that war is not like a first-person shooter video game. He complained of depression while he was in theater. And when he came home, he told the Army psychiatrist that he was thinking of killing himself. And the Army psychiatrist did not believe him. They thought he was lollygagging. They thought he was malingering. They thought he was trying to get out of doing a tough job. And so they ordered him deployed again to Afghanistan. And during his training for that deployment at Fort Bliss in El Paso, he walked off into the New Mexican desert and shot himself in the head with a shotgun. These suicides are 100% preventable. I want to read a little bit from my book. This is the story of Sergeant Brian Rand. He grew up on base at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, military family. Loved the military. I started out in the book talking to his sister, April, who owned a tattoo parlor outside the gates of Camp Lejeune. She was telling me how, when the war first started back in 2003, they were doing a brisk business. Everybody was coming in, trying to get their American flag tattoo, their American eagle tattoo, or other patriotic tattoos. The music was blaring. Then as the war went on, people started to come in and ask for meat tags. Means their serial number, their social security number, something tattooed onto them so that if they became horribly disfigured in the war, that someone would be able to identify them. And then as the war continued, many, many people started coming in for memorial tattoos for those lost in the war. Their military buddies, their son, their daughter, their cousin. They decided to stop playing music in the tattoo parlor. Anyway, this is the story of her brother, Brian Rand. Brian Jason Rand was born December 9th, 1980, into a military family on base at Camp Lejeune. Throughout his life, he had always been in and around the military. He deployed twice to Iraq, returning for the final time on January 2nd, 2007. It was during his first tour that April first noticed a change. She chatted with him every evening over the internet. In the afternoon, while it was nighttime in Baghdad, she would sit in front of her computer in North Carolina, hook up a microphone, and talk with her brother, trying to keep his spirits up. But she could tell her brother was having an emotional meltdown. He would say, "April, I'm having terrible nightmares," she said. He told me about nightmares about dead Iraqis, their souls and spirits haunting him, following him, telling him to do stuff, and it got scarier and scarier. April said she talked Brian to sleep every night during his deployment, trying to keep him alive by giving him something to live for. I would talk to him in a very quiet voice and make sure not to make any sudden noises, she said. I would tell him, "The grass is still green over here. The sky is still blue. Just close your eyes and picture the lawn that we laid on staring up at the sky, and it's still there. When you get back, when your job is done, when you do everything that they have asked you to do, come back to me and we'll lay on the grass and we'll stare at the sky and we don't have to talk about anything." But Brian's return home from Iraq wasn't the end of his nightmares. He was emotionally unstable. He knew he had problems, his family said, and he sought help from the military. He filled out a post-deployment health assessment form, admitting to combat-related nightmares, that he felt down or hopeless and had mood swings. When someone checks yes to these types of things, clearly they should be evaluated for mental help, his widow, Dina Rand, told Clarksville's Leaf Chronicle newspaper. But according to them, he never requested help. Brian Rand never had a chance to see a psychiatrist. Instead of giving him the help he needed, the Army deployed him to Iraq a second time. "We didn't have very many phone conversations at all during his last deployment," his sister April told me. "The phone calls only came when he was spiraling out of control, so it was very difficult to figure out what he was trying to communicate. When he returned to Fort Campbell for the final time in January 2007, his family said he had completely changed. He'd flip on a dime, his wife Dina told the Leaf Chronicle, describing scenarios in public and private that made him paranoid and agitated. The newspaper reported Dina said her husband was either intensely happy or desperately sad. There was no middle ground, which was nothing like the man she married, whom she described as a gentle person who would drop anything he was doing to help anyone. On February 8, 2007, Dina called the police when Brian started screaming at his stepdaughter, Cheyenne. Quote, Mrs. Rand stated that her husband was yelling at her daughter, Officer Matthew Campbell wrote in his report for the Clarksville Police Department. Mrs. Rand went upstairs to make him stop, and she stated that he turned and smacked her in the face. Mr. Rand was gone upon arrival. About the same time, Brian called his sister, April. He said, "Oh, I can see everything, April. It makes perfect sense now. I know what I have to do, and it makes so much sense. I have to die. I have to leave the physical realm and leave Earth and go up into heaven and be part of the army of God. And I've got to stop this war and save my guys here. And the best way I can do that is up in heaven, because I can't do anything while I'm down here." April told me she tried to talk her brother out of suicide. She mentioned that Dina was pregnant with their first child together. That child was going to need a father, she argued. But Brian wouldn't listen. He said, "The baby will be fine," April told me. "The baby will be taken care of." And then he started talking about his favorite music. And then from his favorite music, he goes to saying, "You're going to have to know this. You're going to have to know my favorite movie. When I am gone, you're going to want to watch my favorite movie, April. My favorite movie is Mousetrap." Less than 2 weeks later, on February 20th, 2007, the Clarksville police received a call about a body lying face down under the entertainment pavilion on the banks of the Cumberland River. In their report, officers Heather Hill and Jeff DeRico wrote that 2 citizens called the police and said there was apparently a male person laying on the ground with a gun beside him. We arrived on the scene, made contact with the body. The male was obviously deceased from apparent gunshot wound. Shotgun was lying next to the body. Crime scene was established. Suspect's vehicle was towed to major crimes. Emergency services arrived on the scene and removed the body. Brian Rand did not have to die. His death was 100% preventable, as have many, many of the suicides committed by our U.S. soldiers and veterans. Even when our veterans, even when our soldiers get out of the military and become veterans, they don't end this battle. In fact, they have a brand new one that they have to fight to get into the system at the Department of Veterans Affairs. When you get out of the military, you don't just immediately show up at the VA and get help, unfortunately. You have to get into that system. And it's at that moment that we throw a pile of paperwork at our veterans when they are most wounded and most vulnerable, and we try to get them to go away. Let me give you an example. If you come back from Iraq and you have post-traumatic stress disorder, the very first thing you need to do is fill out a 26-page form where you describe in detail the exact traumatic incidences that occurred that caused you to be so screwed up. You describe your symptoms. You present any relevant military documents. You get letters from the people you served with to corroborate your story. And people who help veterans file this paperwork say it's really a good idea to file a Freedom of Information Act request on yourself and copy your congressperson to make sure that you know everything about yourself that they know. And perhaps there's a document sitting around in their cabinet somewhere that might be helpful to you. But we ask this of somebody who might be having trouble getting up in the morning, who might be having trouble avoiding controlled substances. We tell this to somebody who's struggling to get a job. We tell this to somebody who is having trouble perhaps reconnecting to their family. I'll tell you the story about Specialist James Eggemeyer of Stuart, Florida. His story, I think, really illustrates what happens because the system is set up this way. The average wait time for a disability claim with the VA to be resolved goes between 6 months and 2 years. And that's if there's no disagreement. That's just the paperwork going back and forth. If there's a disagreement, the appeals process can go on for an average of 4.5 years. The VA says the waiting list, the number of people waiting in this queue, is now about 600,000 names long. The waits are so long that leading up to March 31st of 2008, 1,500 veterans died waiting to learn if the VA was going to give them a disability check. And the only reason we even know that statistic is because of a lawsuit that was filed by Veterans for Common Sense and Veterans United for Truth, where they had a large discovery phase. They got a lot of this information together. And I want to recognize Bob Handy, I see him over here, who was part of that lawsuit. Thank you. What is the cost of this? The cost of this is that we take people who just need to stabilize themselves right after they get out of the service, who are dealing with their war wounds, and we exacerbate their problems by making them wait for the help that they critically need. So James Eggemeyer of Stuart, Florida, he served in the first year of the war in Iraq. He drove convoys. He's a paratrooper. He injured a shoulder and his back while he was still in training. He was sent over anyway, didn't really report it, thought it would just be good to go, didn't want to be a lollygagger. While he was in Iraq, one of his jobs was to load the bodies of the dead. People were killed in incidents, both American and Iraqi, into helicopters so they could be taken away somewhere else and buried. And you don't come back from that the same. But he did come back. He came back to his own community in Florida, tried to get a job at a car wash, making $8 an hour, because there's no special hero job that's available for you when you get out of the service. But he couldn't hold that job. His back hurt, his shoulder hurt. It was manual labor. He had trouble interacting with his boss. And when his boss wouldn't give him Memorial Day off, they had one of those, you can't fire me, I quit moments. So James decided at that point to file a disability claim with the VA. He couldn't work at a car wash. He needed to get his life straight. He needed help from our government. Well, while he was waiting 8 months for the VA to decide his claim, he lost his house. He lost contact with his son. He couldn't get into the medical care system, so he started popping pain pills like nobody's business, and he crashed his truck, which was also his house. And if it hadn't been for support from charities in his community who provided him with a new used truck, or a used truck, as he said to me, he would literally have been living on the street less than a year removed from combat in Iraq. So James was really at his wit's end. He called a friend of mine who's a documentary filmmaker. This documentary filmmaker said, well, I can't just do a story about this. You need to call my friend Aaron. He's more of a news reporter. I investigated his story. I published it. And Senator Nelson of Florida read the article. And he went through the roof. He called the VA and he asked how it was that this was the case, and James got his disability check. So essentially, it took the intervention of a reporter and a senator to get the government to do what it should be doing anyway. So here we are a year and a half after that. James is living pretty modestly outside of Atlanta. He's reconnecting with his son. He's stabilizing his life. He still can't work, but instead of his life being in a downward spiral, it's in an upward spiral towards recovery. When I was in Atlanta on my book tour speaking at the Carter Center, he joined me, and afterwards he said, "You know, Aaron, you really saved my life." And I believed him. And I just thought about how sad that was, that he could have continued to spiral downward if his story hadn't been written up by a journalist. Because this is the kind of thing that our government should be doing anyway. The really sad thing is that none of this would be happening if our VA system was set up to be as friendly as the IRS. Now, I can tell by your laughter that you don't really like the IRS that much, and I know that I'm not the biggest fan of filling out my taxes, and especially the part about paying them. But think about it for a moment. Right now, we're all getting our W-2s, we're getting our 1099s, we probably all have them stuffed in a drawer right now waiting till the last minute to fill out our taxes. And when we send that in, you know what the IRS is going to do? They're going to send us a refund check right away. Or, if we owe them money, they're going to cash our check right away. Then, later on, down the line, they're going to audit us to make sure that we were telling the truth. But on the front end, they believe us. Can you imagine if our IRS was set up the way our VA is set up, where we didn't get our refund until we had proved conclusively to the VA, to the IRS, that we deserved it, and we would wait years to get our refund checks? And the really amazing thing is that the VA ultimately decides 90% of the time that the veteran is telling the truth. And the whole system is set up, like I said in the beginning, to just hope that the veteran gives up and goes away. These problems are long-standing. It's probably that, going back to the Congresswoman was saying at the outset, conversation happening 30 years ago in the hills outside of Santa Barbara going much the same way as the conversation that I'm having now. We had to wait 26 years after the end of the Vietnam War for the government to admit that Agent Orange was the cause of problems in our Vietnam veterans. We had to wait 17 years after the Persian Gulf War for the government to admit that Gulf War syndrome was a real injury that affected hundreds of thousands of veterans of the Persian Gulf War. My hope right now is that we don't have to wait that long with this generation of veterans. Because, as Senator Max Cleland told me, the courageous triple amputee from the Vietnam War, who went on to serve in President Carter's administration and was then drowned out in the lead up to this war for being unpatriotic. He said, "I've seen this movie. I've been in this movie. I know how it ends. I want a different script this time." We can see the impact of not caring for our Vietnam generation on the streets of this country, where we have, on any given night, 200,000 homeless veterans. And we know what to do about this because we have seen this movie before. The first step is recognizing in public, in a big way, that this is an issue. And I have some hope here. Under President Bush, people who stood up and said that war causes casualties were eliminated. Anthony Principi, George Bush's first Secretary of Veterans Affairs, told him when he started the Iraq War that he needed to hire more doctors, nurses, and claims adjusters at the VA because there would be lots and lots of new Iraq and Afghanistan war veteran patients, and at the same time our Vietnam and World War II veterans were not getting any younger, and he was fired. Dr. Francis Murphy was hired by the VA to do a mental health assessment to find out how well the VA was doing a good job of reaching out to our returning Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans in terms of mental health care. She found that our mental health services were so inaccessible as to be worthless, and she was fired. So we got a lot of making up to do now in the Obama administration. The good news is that President Obama had a very good record when he was Senator Obama, that he made a lot of good campaign promises on the campaign trail, and that he has appointed General Eric Shinseki as VA Secretary, somebody who had the courage, when the Iraq War was starting, to deliver some unpleasant news to Donald Rumsfeld. This is all good news. It was really wonderful for me seeing President Obama set out his Iraq war policy this past week at Camp Lejeune, that he understood in his speech that the war will continue for many years in those who fought it, that no matter what you think of his specific policy of drawing down our forces in Iraq over 18 months and increasing our involvement in Afghanistan, and I have some serious concerns about that he specifically said that he was committed to taking care of people for post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury, and that his budget contains billions of dollars more for these services. So that's all good news. What concerns me is what I was talking about at the beginning, that we as a country are not engaged, that you can see more of the octuplet mom on television than you can discussion of our veterans. And this is important because we need to have this discussion outside of a gathering like this one. We need to have it on national television. You know, we need to have it in every community college in this country where hundreds of thousands of veterans are coming back to school and starting their college education. You know, I said that when I came home from Iraq, people were more concerned about whether they should buy the iPod or the iTouch, and that was infuriating to me. Today, people are concerned about weighty matters. Can they keep their home? You know, can they keep their job? These are important things. But ignoring the concerns of the veterans coming home during this critical time in our own communities, no matter what our motivations are, will turn out the same. And so I guess I come here today with a lot of hope and optimism, and also an understanding of the reality of the long haul, and that it's really going to take all of us to end this battle that our veterans have to fight against Washington. So thank you very much.
What about the double-edged sword of, now that the public is becoming aware of PTSD, which it wasn't at the beginning of this war, about employers hiring veterans who they might fear have problems? It certainly was an issue with the Vietnam vets, and I'm wondering what any of the current...
Yeah, I mean, this is a big issue, especially since, according to the VA, in 2007, 18% of returning Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans were already unemployed. That was before this economic crisis that we're in. And that a large percentage were making less than $21,000 a year, working jobs like the one I said James was working at, the car wash. I haven't done a lot of work with employers, but I've been doing a lot of reporting recently at community colleges because I see a tremendous number of students coming home, you know, veterans coming home and going to school, and I see that double-edged sword on the college campus, you know, of on the one hand the tremendous struggle for recognition, and on the other hand a desire that people not stigmatize them even as they're trying to be proud of themselves. I think that what I see working is people being out in public and together in a veterans club on a community college campus. You know, that's where I've been looking. And then you have a whole group of people supporting each other, getting stronger, sometimes with support from the government, often not, right now, should be support from the government. And I think that that's kind of the answer to the concern that you're raising.
I have a question about a drug called Larium. And my understanding is that this is given to the troops for malaria. And the side effects are insomnia, hallucinations, depression, suicidal thoughts, suicide, spousal abuse. And I would like to know to what extent this is actually being given to our troops and if that is being tracked.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the specific answer to your question about Larium, but I can tell you that many, many troops are being given Larium, that you are correct about the side effects, and that in many cases, people who have had some of these side effects have been told that they have a pre-existing condition. There was a story that was actually done by Bob Woodruff of ABC News about Andrew Pogany, who came back to Colorado Springs, Colorado, and had a very negative reaction to Larium, and they attempted to give him a dishonorable discharge because he was acting crazy, but in fact, we later learned that it was in reaction to Larium. Our troops are being given all kinds of crap, and some of it is possibly necessary and some of it is possibly unnecessary. But this is a big fight that happened after the Persian Gulf War with Gulf War syndrome, and people not really knowing what exactly had caused their affliction because their military had pumped them with so many different drugs. And one of the answers that I have to what you're saying is that we didn't know that Agent Orange was going to be Agent Orange in 1965. We learned that later. Mm-hmm. There are a whole variety of things that could very well be the Agent Orange of this war. The pills that our soldiers are given, the depleted uranium that they are exposed to, the burn pits. I don't know if you are aware of this. There's been some reporting on it that in Iraq, the way that our military disposes of the trash, including of many, many toxic chemicals, is to throw it in a big heap and then burn it. And then the soldiers stand guard over it while it burns. So there's going to be a lot of things down the line that we're going to have to pay attention to, and Larium is just one of them.
So what can the public do to stop the armed services from giving our troops this drug if we know it's so bad?
I don't know specifically about Larium, but I know there are a number of efforts underway about the issue of these drugs. Another drug that caused a lot of concern is the anthrax vaccine that people were being given. I believe that was stopped, in response to popular protest, and maybe we can talk a little bit afterwards about it.
Okay, thanks.
I'm not sure, partly because of the first question that was asked. I applaud your effort to highlight the government's lack of effort in caring for and acknowledging the veteran. I know when we came back from Vietnam, one of the traumas that we experienced in Vietnam were compounded by the trauma of not being accepted by the people in the United States, that we were looked down upon and blamed for the war. That, as Representative Capps mentioned in her comment, that mainly doesn't seem to be the case anymore, that people seem to have somehow figured that out, that the warrior isn't responsible for the war. And the public, while there are many injustices and there are things that, I don't know, that we all need to do, but that personal stigma doesn't seem to be the same. Do you see that as making a difference, that the individual isn't blamed as much as the Vietnam warrior was?
Well, what I see is that the public is asleep, and that has its own problem. So I was in Washington, D.C. at a screening of Ken Burns' excellent multi-part series about World War II, The War. And there were 3 veterans on stage. One of them was a World War II veteran, a Vietnam vet, an Iraq War veteran who had been an interrogator at Abu Ghraib. And the World War II veteran said when we came home, they welcomed us. And the Vietnam vet said when I came home, they spat on me. And the Iraq War veteran said when I came home, nobody cared. So I think that we have gotten beyond Vietnam, but maybe we've gotten too far, you know. And so we have to focus our attention in all of our own communities. And I think that, you know, when the public is more engaged, then the leaders will follow. You know, that's been said before. But I think that we have a new dynamic which has its own perils this time.
I'm sorry, I can't use the mic because I just had knee surgery. Aaron, I have a question. You gave that example of the soldier in Florida who'd only been home a year, and in a sense, he was now living on the street. My own memory of the people that came back from Vietnam is that it was much more than a year before families and friends and people gave up, so to speak.
Yeah.
So that was a concerning example. Can you amplify on that?
Yeah, well, when I talk to service providers, what they will tell me is that, because, you know, as you can see, I was not around for the Vietnam War. I was born in 1977. But what they tell me is that people did not, on average, become homeless. We did not start to see large numbers of homeless Vietnam veterans until the 80s, you know, about 9 years after 1973, the Paris Peace Accords, and that we are seeing that happen much faster now. And I think that there are a couple of reasons for this. The first reason is that our country is not at war, only our military is at war. And so when you talk about those family, those friends, I mean, at least during Vietnam, people were paying attention. You know, now somebody comes back and people just don't know what to do with them. And so those bridges are being burned much faster. I think also our society has become a little bit of a meaner society. I mean, just away from this veterans issue, you know, so the social safety net is much less than it was, you know, in the mid to late 70s. And so, you know, if somebody doesn't specifically seek out the veterans services and then engage in this battle that I'm talking about, there's less likely to be something else for them. So I think that those are two things that we should be very concerned about. Yeah.
Let's all thank Aaron Glantz for the
Well, thank you.